In the forgotten corner of Grayfield, Emma Collins stood ankle-deep in discarded materials. Her pregnant belly curved beneath the worn fabric of her jacket, a stark contrast to the broken landscape surrounding her. September winds swept through the overgrown weeds, carrying the scent of rust and rotting wood, of dreams abandoned and futures foreclosed. She was 26 years old, 13 weeks pregnant, and completely alone in a town that had itself been abandoned by progress, by industry, by hope. Grayfield had once been the beating heart of Michigan's steel country. The Grayfield Steel Works employed 3,000 souls at its peak, fathers and sons and grandfathers, who shaped molten metal into the skeleton of America's infrastructure. Bridges spanning great rivers, skyscrapers piercing eastern clouds, automobiles rolling off assembly lines in Detroit, all of them carried the fingerprints of Grayfield workers. Then the factories in China began producing steel at half the cost. The executives made calculations on spreadsheets that never accounted for the lives those numbers represented. 12 years ago, the mill went silent. The town began its slow death. Now foreclosure signs outnumbered occupied homes 3-1. Storefronts that once displayed wedding dresses and hardware and fresh-baked bread stood dark behind plywood barriers spray-painted with vulgar poetry. The population had hemorrhaged from 45,000 to 28,000. Those with means escaping to cities where opportunity still existed. Those without means trapped in a geography of decline. Unemployment hovered at 19%, double the state average, triple the national figure. The American dream had packed its bags and left Grayfield behind. Emma's fingers trembled as she held the torn photograph, her thumb tracing the jagged edge where Tyler's smiling face had been ripped away. 6 months ago, they had posed together at the Grayfield County Fair, cotton candy melting between their fingers, futures intertwined like the vines on the Ferris wheel's framework. He had won her a stuffed bear at the shooting gallery, laughing when his first 3 shots missed entirely, determined when the 4th and 5th found their marks. She still carried that bear in her backpack, its synthetic fur matted now, one glass eye hanging by a thread. They had met at Maple Street Brew, the coffee shop where Emma worked as a barista. Tyler was a regular, Americano black, corner table by the window, laptop open to spreadsheets and property listings. He told her he worked in real estate consulting, independent contractor, flexible schedule. He never mentioned family. She never asked. There was romance in mystery, she had thought. There was safety in not knowing too much. 3 weeks ago, everything shattered. The pregnancy test displayed 2 pink lines in the cramped bathroom of their shared apartment. Tyler stared at the plastic stick as if it were a warrant for his arrest. His jaw tightened. His eyes went flat. Without a word, he stood, retrieved his leather jacket from the hook by the door, and walked out into the September evening. The door closed behind him with a sound that still echoed in Emma's nightmares. She called 47 times in the following days. Each call went to voicemail. Each voicemail went unanswered. On the 3rd day, a text message arrived. "Stop calling, not my problem." 4 words, each one a blade. Each one a door slamming shut on a life she thought she was building. The landlord gave her 2 weeks when she could not produce rent. Mr. Martinez was not a cruel man, merely a practical one. He had a mortgage, property taxes, maintenance costs. Sympathy did not pay bills. On the 14th day, Emma found her belongings stacked on the sidewalk in garbage bags. The locks changed. Her key now useless metal. She tried the shelter first. Full capacity, waiting list 3 weeks minimum. She tried the housing assistance office. 18-month backlog, emergency placements reserved for families with children already born. She tried the community center where she had once attended free yoga classes. Closed permanently due to budget constraints, the sign weathered and peeling. Every door she knocked on led to another dead end, another apologetic face, another explanation of how the system was overwhelmed and resources stretched thin, and perhaps she could try again next month. The Grayfield Public Library became her refuge. She arrived each morning when the doors opened at 9, stayed until closing at 9 in the evening. Miss Robinson, the head librarian with silver hair and bifocals perpetually sliding down her nose, never questioned Emma's constant presence. Perhaps she recognized the desperation beneath the surface. Perhaps she remembered her own struggles during the recession of 2008 when the library's funding had been slashed and her own job hung by a thread. Whatever her reasons, she allowed Emma to exist within those walls, to read pregnancy books and construction manuals, to wash her face in the bathroom and charge her phone at outlets hidden behind stacks of encyclopedias. No one consulted anymore. Night was the enemy. Emma walked the streets until exhaustion claimed her, then found doorways and park benches and the covered bus stop on Morrison Avenue, where the last bus stopped running at midnight. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by cold and fear, and the relentless anxiety that something was wrong with the baby growing inside her. Then she found the lot. It sat at the edge of the Eastern District, hidden behind a tangle of forsythia bushes that had not bloomed in years. Unlike the other abandoned properties with their pick-and-clean remains and graffiti-covered walls, this one still held the skeleton of a collapsed garden shed. Weathered 2x4s jutted from the debris like bones from a shallow grave. Broken furniture spilled across the weeds. A kitchen chair missing 2 legs, a nightstand with its drawer hanging open, the frame of what might once have been a child's bed. Construction materials from nearby renovation projects had accumulated in piles. Bent pipes, cracked drywall, warped plywood deemed too damaged to use. To anyone else, this was a junkyard, an eyesore, a symbol of everything wrong with modern America. To Emma, standing in the fading light of a September evening, rain threatening from purple clouds on the western horizon, it was possibility, the only possibility she had left. That first night, she constructed a lean-to against the single standing wall of the shed, using a blue tarp she had discovered behind Henderson's hardware store. The plastic crinkled and flapped as wind swept across the lot, but it held. Rain began to fall around midnight, drumming against her makeshift roof, pooling in the low spots of the uneven ground. Emma curled beneath the tarp with her backpack as a pillow, one hand resting protectively over her belly. "We'll figure something out," she whispered into the darkness. "I promise you, we'll find a way." Sleep came eventually, brought by exhaustion rather than comfort. Her dreams were filled with hammers and nails, and the voice of her father teaching her how to measure twice and cut once. Robert Collins had been a construction worker, a man whose hands carried the calluses of 30 years building other people's homes. When Emma was 12, they had spent an entire summer renovating their kitchen together. He taught her to read a tape measure, to identify load-bearing walls, to feel the grain of wood beneath her fingers and understand which direction it wanted to bend. Cancer took him when she was 18, lung cancer from asbestos exposure at job sites that had promised safety and delivered poison. The insurance company fought the claim for 2 years before settling for an amount that barely covered his medical bills. Now, lying in the rain beneath a plastic sheet, Emma summoned those memories like prayers. Her father's patient voice explaining why corner bracing mattered, his weathered hands guiding hers as she drove her first nail true. The pride in his eyes when she correctly identified a structural problem that even the contractor had missed. "Construction is honest work," he had told her once, wiping sawdust from his forehead. "The wood doesn't lie. The nails don't pretend. You build something right, and it stands. You cut corners, and eventually it falls. Simple as that." Simple as that. Emma closed her eyes and let the rain sing her to sleep. Morning brought clarity born of necessity. She had no money for rent, no job prospects, no family nearby to take her in. Her mother had passed 3 years after her father, heart attack while gardening, gone before the ambulance could arrive. Her only sibling, an older brother named David, had moved to Australia a decade ago and now communicated exclusively through annual Christmas cards. There was no safety net. There was only herself and the life growing within her, and the determination that had carried her through every obstacle she had ever faced. She began with research. The library became her classroom, construction manuals and architecture books piled on the table before her. Tiny house movements, emergency shelter designs, repurposed materials and DIY insulation techniques. She filled a notebook with sketches and calculations, ignoring the curious glances from other patrons, refusing to acknowledge the pitying looks from the homeless men who recognized one of their own. Miss Robinson noticed her interest on the 4th day. "School project?" she inquired, helping Emma locate a manual on Michigan building codes. "Life project," Emma replied without meeting her eyes. A paper bag appeared on the table beside her the following morning. Turkey sandwich, an apple, and a small carton of orange juice. Miss Robinson said nothing about it, merely smiled and returned to her duties. The gesture brought tears to Emma's eyes, the first kindness from a stranger since her world had collapsed. Afternoons were devoted to scavenging. Emma pulled a folding cart she had found discarded behind the supermarket, its wheels squeaking in protest as she loaded it with materials others had deemed worthless. Bent nails that could be straightened with rocks. Half-empty paint cans from behind a renovated restaurant. Cardboard from appliance boxes, useful for insulation. Plastic sheeting from a construction site, its edges tattered but the center still intact. The work was exhausting. Her body ached from bending and lifting, from walking miles across the decaying town in search of materials. The pregnancy added weight and fatigue, turned simple tasks into marathons. Some nights she collapsed onto her sleeping bag before the sun had fully set, too tired even to eat the canned food she had collected from a church food bank. But the structure grew, day by day, piece by piece. The lean-to became four walls, precarious at first, then strengthened by salvaged brackets from a discarded bed frame. The walls slowly accumulated covering, plywood here, particle board there, weathered paneling from what appeared to have been a garden shed in its previous life. The roof evolved from a single tarp to overlapping sheets of corrugated plastic, arranged in a pattern that directed rainwater away from the structure rather than through it. 2 weeks after she began building, Emma noticed she was being watched. The woman stood at a second-floor window in one of the few occupied homes nearby, a small Cape Cod with peeling white paint in a vegetable garden that showed signs of careful attention despite the surrounding decay. She was Asian, elderly, perhaps 70 years old, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun and eyes that assessed everything they touched. She made no gesture of acknowledgement when Emma's gaze found her. She simply observed, her expression unreadable, neither welcoming nor hostile. Emma had seen her before during her scavenging expeditions. The mailbox at the end of her driveway read Nguyen in hand-painted letters. The paint faded, but the strokes precise. A set of carpenter's tools rested on the back porch. Handsaw, hammer, chisels square, arranged with the care of cherished possessions, but covered in a thin layer of dust that suggested months or years of disuse. Someone in that house had been a woodworker, someone who no longer practiced their craft. The question of why lingered in Emma's mind as she returned to her construction. There was something in that woman's stillness, in her silent observation, that suggested a story waiting to be told. 3 weeks into her building project, the man appeared. He stood at the edge of her lot, hands in the pockets of his jeans, flannel shirt rolled to the elbows despite the October chill. Mid-30s, Emma guessed. Short brown hair, cut military style. Work boots that had seen actual work. A Timex watch on his wrist. Practical, unassuming. The choice of someone who valued function over fashion. You planning to deliver the baby in there too? Emma turned from the window frame she was attempting to seal, positioning herself instinctively between the stranger and her shelter's entrance. That's the plan. Something I can help you with? His hands rose in a gesture of peace, palms forward, no threat intended. Frank Morrison, city building inspector. He paused, studying the structure with what appeared to be professional assessment rather than personal judgment. Been watching you work for about a week now. Your cross-bracing on that frame is textbook perfect. The technical language relaxed something in Emma's chest. This was not a predator or a criminal or someone looking to cause trouble. This was a man who understood construction. Library books and YouTube, she admitted, when I can get Wi-Fi. Self-taught then. Frank nodded slowly, stepping closer to examine a corner joint. Not bad at all. His eyes moved across the walls, the roof, the foundation she had improvised from salvaged cinder blocks and wooden pallets. You know this is private property, right? Belongs to Grayfield Development Group. They've got plans to clear this whole district eventually. Emma's jaw tightened. It's been abandoned for years. Doesn't matter who's using it, matters who owns the deed. Frank's gaze returned to her face, taking in the dark circles under her eyes, the slight swell of pregnancy beneath her oversized sweatshirt, the dirt permanently embedded under her fingernails. No electrical hookup, no plumbing, no permit, violations across the board. Are you here to shut me down? The question hung between them. Frank Morrison, city building inspector, had the authority to condemn this structure with a single form. He could have police here within the hour, could have Emma removed and her work demolished before sunset. "I'm here to assess the situation," he said carefully. "Haven't filed any reports yet." He walked the perimeter of her shelter, pointing out issues as he moved. "Roof pitch is too shallow, maybe 20 degrees. Michigan's snow loads require 30 minimum, or you'll have collapse by February. Foundation's too low. Need at least 6 inches clearance from ground level to prevent moisture damage. And your connection points between walls and roof need metal brackets, not just nails." Emma listened, her notebook already in hand, recording every criticism. This was not hostility. This was education disguised as inspection. "Why are you helping me?" she asked when he finished his circuit. "Your job is to close places like this down." Frank did not answer immediately. His attention shifted to the small house where the elderly Asian woman still watched from her second-floor window. Something passed across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. "Mrs. Nguyen has lived in that house for 40 years, he said, nodding toward the window. "Only person in this whole district who refused to sell when the development company came around buying properties. 3 offers, 3 refusals." He turned back to Emma. "You've picked an interesting corner of Grayfield to build on." With that, he was gone, leaving Emma with a notebook full of criticisms and a growing list of questions she had no answers for. Frank Morrison returned twice in the following week. The first time, he brought a battered copy of the Michigan Building Code with yellow sticky notes marking relevant sections. The second time, a box of metal brackets and weatherproof sealant that he claimed were surplus from a job site, though Emma suspected they had been purchased specifically for her. "I can't officially help you," he explained each time, "but if you ask me technical questions, I can answer them as a private citizen." "Nothing in the rules about that?" she asked. He answered. Slowly, her shelter transformed from desperate improvisation into something approaching legitimate construction. The 4th week of October brought the storm. It arrived without mercy, ice and wind and darkness descending on Grayfield with the ferocity of judgment. Weather reports had predicted thunderstorms, but what came was worse. An ice storm, that peculiar Michigan phenomenon where rain freezes instantly upon contact with any surface, coating everything in a crystalline shell that weighs down power lines and tree branches and dreams alike. Emma was frantically securing loose materials when she spotted movement at the edge of her lot. A bright red umbrella, incongruous against the darkening sky, moved toward her through the overgrown weeds. Mrs. Nguyen emerged from the gathering gloom, her small frame somehow commanding, despite the chaos of wind and approaching rain. "Storm coming!" Her English carried the cadence of Vietnam, clipped consonants and rising tones, but clear enough. "Bad one. Not regular storm." She pressed the umbrella into Emma's hands before any response could form. "Need more support there." One weathered finger pointed to the southwest corner where wall met roof. "Wind comes from that direction. My husband was carpenter. He would say same thing." "Your husband? Gone 15 years now." The words carried weight, but not weakness. "Use umbrella, don't be stubborn." She turned and walked back toward her house, leaving Emma holding the red umbrella as the first drops of frozen rain began to fall. The sky opened 30 minutes later. Not rain, but ice coating every surface in a treacherous glaze that made the ground a skating rink and the air a weapon. Wind screamed around Emma's shelter, finding every gap and weakness in her construction. The blue tarp she had originally used, now repurposed as additional insulation for the east wall, tore free and vanished into the darkness. A gust that had to be 50 miles per hour struck the structure like a fist. The western roof panel, corrugated plastic she had carefully overlapped and sealed just days ago, ripped away from its moorings and sailed across the lot like a wounded bird. "No!" Emma scrambled outside, abandoning the red umbrella in her haste. Ice coated her immediately, plastering her hair to her face, making every step treacherous. She chased the flying panel, slipping on the frozen ground, going down hard on one knee before forcing herself upright. Her fingers closed on the panel's edge, just as lightning split the sky in half. Thunder followed, a physical force that seemed to shake the earth itself. For a moment, Emma stood paralyzed, rain and ice streaming down her face. The roof panel clutched in hands that had gone numb with cold. She was going to lose everything. The shelter she had spent a month building. The hope she had desperately cultivated. The belief that she could create safety through sheer determination. Then headlights swept across the lot. A Ford pickup, mud-splattered and dented, skidded to a stop at the edge of the property. Frank Morrison jumped out, yellow rain slicker whipping in the wind, and sprinted toward her without hesitation. "Inside," he shouted, grabbing the other end of the panel. "We can fix this." They dragged the plastic sheet back together, ice pelting their exposed skin, wind fighting every step. Inside the shelter, water poured through the gap in the roof, soaking Emma's sleeping bag, ruining the library books she had borrowed. Frank grabbed a battery-powered drill from his jacket, had he brought it specifically for this, and began reattaching the panel while Emma held it in place. "Southeast wall is bowing," she yelled over the storm's howl. Frank looked, assessed, cursed under his breath. "We need bracing. 2x4s. You have any?" She did. They worked in tandem, Emma holding lumber in position, while Frank drove screws with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times. The wall stabilized. The roof held. Water still dripped through a dozen small gaps, but the structure did not collapse. By midnight, the worst had passed. Steady rain replaced the ice storm's fury, gentler if no less wet. Emma sat on the floor of her damaged shelter, surrounded by puddles and ruined belongings, exhaustion finally claiming her now that the crisis had passed. Frank Morrison sat opposite her, his back against the wall she had built from salvaged pallets, his rain slicker forming a pool of water around him. Neither spoke for several minutes. "Why were you out in an ice storm at midnight?" Emma finally asked. The question had been burning since she saw his headlights. Frank was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough, as if the words had been buried deep and disinterred only with effort. "When I was 5 years old, my father left. Just walked out one day and never came back. My mother, she was a secretary, minimum wage, barely enough to cover groceries, let alone rent. When the eviction came, we had nowhere to go." He paused, staring at a point somewhere beyond the walls of Emma's shelter. "We lived in a 1985 Honda Civic for 8 months. My mother and me, that car, our only home." Emma remained silent, sensing there was more. "Michigan winters. You know what that's like. Sub-zero some nights, frost on the inside of the windows. My mother piled every blanket we owned on top of me, kept me warm while she shivered in the front seat." His voice dropped. "Every night she told me the same thing. Tomorrow will be better, son." Every night I believed her. "Your mother, where is she now?" "Pneumonia, second winter after we finally got off the streets. I was 9. She was 34 years old." Frank finally met Emma's eyes. "No health insurance. I went into foster care until I aged out at 18. Something slipped free in Emma's chest. Recognition, perhaps, of shared suffering. "That's why you became a building inspector." "I wanted to make sure everyone has a safe place to live. That's what I told myself when I started this job. Enforce the codes, keep people safe." His jaw tightened. But the codes were written by people who never slept in cars. People who never had to choose between paying for food or paying for heat. The system protects property, not people. "You're risking your career by helping me." "Maybe." Frank stood, water dripping from his clothes onto the already soaked floor. "Or maybe I'm finally doing the job right." He left before dawn, promising to return the following day. Emma sat alone in her damaged shelter as gray light crept over the horizon, one hand resting on her belly, where the baby shifted and kicked as if offering encouragement. The red umbrella lay where she had dropped it during the storm, its bright color a shock against the muddy ground. Mrs. Nguyen's gift. Mrs. Nguyen's warning about the southwest corner. Mrs. Nguyen's husband, who had been a carpenter. Connections were forming in Emma's mind, pieces of a puzzle she did not yet fully understand. Morning after the storm, damage assessment revealed the extent of what Emma had nearly lost and what she had managed to save. The roof needed resealing in 6 places. The southeast wall required additional bracing. Her sleeping bag was ruined, along with 4 library books she would somehow have to replace. But the structure stood. Against ice and wind and all the force nature could muster, her walls remained upright. "Mrs. Nguyen appeared at the edge of the lot as Emma surveyed the destruction, her black coat buttoned against the October chill. Not bad, she observed, eyes scanning the building with expert evaluation. Survived ice storm. Many proper houses cannot say same. Emma accepted the compliment, rare as it was, but needs repair. Correct repair. Mrs. Nguyen pointed to the still bowed southeastern wall. Come to my house, dry clothes, hot tea. Then I show you something. The invitation was unexpected. In the weeks since Emma had begun building, Mrs. Nguyen had observed but never approached beyond the brief exchange during the storm. Now she stood offering entry into her home, her private space, with an urgency that suggested more than hospitality. Mrs. Nguyen's house smelled of fish sauce and jasmine, the sense of a kitchen that had prepared 10,000 meals and remembered each one. Photographs covered every wall. A man in his 50s with sun-darkened skin and a gentle smile, standing beside a much younger Mrs. Nguyen. Wedding photos, family portraits, a teenage girl in graduation robes. My husband, Hung. Mrs. Nguyen noticed Emma's attention. Best carpenter in Grayfield, they said, could make wood sing. When did he? 15 years. The answer came with practiced neutrality, but something beneath it cut sharper. Work accident at construction site. She led Emma to a corner of the living room where a wooden box sat on a low table, perhaps 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, hand-carved with traditional Vietnamese patterns that Emma could not name but recognized as meaningful. The craftsmanship was exquisite, joints so tight they seemed to have grown together rather than been assembled. Inside the box lay carpenter's tools, a handsaw with a rosewood handle, a hammer worn smooth by decades of use, a set of chisels arranged by size, a brass-fitted square that caught the light like jewelry. Husband's tools, Mrs. Nguyen said, kept since he passed, never used. I can't take these. Not taking, using. Mrs. Nguyen fixed Emma with a look that brooked no argument. Tools have value when they work, when they help. Sitting in box is not purpose. Hung would say same thing. Emma accepted the tools with reverence, understanding that this was not charity, but investiture. These implements had built homes and furniture and dreams for decades. Now they would build hers. In the days that followed, Mrs. Nguyen began teaching Emma the skills her husband had passed to her. How to achieve a perfect 90-degree angle without relying on measurement alone. How to read the grain of wood and understand its natural strengths and weaknesses. How to create mortise and tenon joints that would outlast glue and nails combined. How to measure twice and cut once, her husband's favorite axiom repeated until it became mantra. Hung always said, good house needs good foundation, not just concrete. Patience and precision, too. Emma absorbed everything, her notebook filling with diagrams and techniques in the accumulated wisdom of a master craftsman passed through his widow. The shelter transformed under this new knowledge. Walls grew straighter, joints grew tighter. What had been desperate improvisation became deliberate construction. November arrived with its shortened days and bitter winds, but the work continued. It was during a research session at the library, searching for information about variance permits and hardship exemptions at Frank's suggestion, that Emma stumbled upon the connection. The Grayfield Gazette maintained digital archives of past issues, accessible through the library's computer terminals. Emma had been searching for information about Grayfield Development Group, the company that owned the land her shelter occupied, when a photograph stopped her cold. The article was dated 2015. Harrison family acquires majority stake in Grayfield Development Group. The photo showed 2 men, William Harrison, 63 years old according to the caption, silver-haired and wearing a suit that cost more than Emma's annual salary as a barista, and beside him, Tyler Harrison, Vice President of Community Relations, the caption read, not freelance real estate consultant, not independent contractor. The son of the CEO, heir apparent to a development empire that was systematically acquiring distressed properties throughout Grayfield. Emma's hands trembled as she continued searching. 2019, Harrison Family Foundation donates to mayor's campaign. 2017, Grayfield Development Group wins Eastern District contract. 2012, community groups question lack of affordable housing in Harrison projects. And then, buried in archives from 2009, construction worker dies at Harrison development site. Family questions, safety protocols. The article bore a photograph of a man Emma now recognized from the pictures on Mrs. Nguyen's walls. Nguyen Van Hung, age 52, killed when the floor of a Harrison Properties construction project collapsed. Witnesses reported inadequate safety equipment. Warnings about structural instability had been ignored. The company denied negligence. A follow-up article, 6 months later, announced a confidential out-of-court settlement between the Nguyen family and Harrison Properties. Emma sat frozen at the library terminal, ice spreading through her veins that had nothing to do with the November cold. Tyler had not abandoned her simply because he was too cowardly to face fatherhood. He had vanished because discovery of their relationship would connect his family to the very land on which she had chosen to build. Land his company owned, land where his father's negligence had killed a man whose widow still watched from her window. The conspiracy was not vast or complex. It was simply cold calculation. Emma represented risk to the Harrison empire, risk that could not be managed through money alone, risk that might expose old sins and new development plans, and the fundamental rot at the heart of a family that had built wealth upon the bodies of working men. She printed the articles with hands that shook. Mrs. Nguyen deserved to know what Emma had discovered, and then they needed to find out what else might be hidden beneath the surface of Grayfield's decay. Lily Chen arrived during the second week of November, delivered by her mother in a silver SUV that looked startlingly clean against the Eastern District's grime. 10 years old with a ponytail and a pink jacket and a Hello Kitty backpack, she burst from the vehicle with the energy of a child who had been confined too long. "Grandma!" The English was perfect American, born and raised, no trace of the accent that colored her grandmother's speech. "I'm here." Mrs. Nguyen emerged onto her porch, and something in her customarily stern face softened into genuine warmth. Emma watched the reunion from her lot, a woman in her 30s who must be Mrs. Nguyen's daughter, embracing her mother, exchanging rapid Vietnamese, kissing her own daughter goodbye before driving away. Lily would stay for Thanksgiving break, 2 weeks with her grandmother while her parents traveled for business. 2 days later, the girl appeared at the edge of Emma's property, eyes wide as she examined the shelter that had grown from scattered debris into something resembling an actual home. "Did you build this all by yourself?" "With help from your grandmother and a friend." Emma set down the hammer she had been using, one of Mr. Hung's tools, its weight now familiar in her grip. "You must be Lily." "Grandma said Grandpa used to be a carpenter. I never met him." The girl showed no hesitation, no adult caution, simply curiosity and the directness of childhood. "He died before I was born. Grandma has a box of his stuff, but she won't let me look at it. She says not yet, but she never says when." Emma thought of the tools now housed in her shelter, the box from which they had come, the secrets Mrs. Nguyen had begun to share. Sometimes grown-ups need time before they can explain things. Lily accepted this with the easy wisdom of children who have not yet learned to demand immediate answers. She visited every day after that, watching Emma work, asking questions about construction techniques, practicing with a small hammer on scraps of wood under Emma's supervision. She was bright and eager and entirely unaware of the darker currents flowing beneath the surface of her grandmother's life. It was Lily who found the secret. 3 days before Thanksgiving, she came running from her grandmother's house, voice carrying across the cold November air. Miss Emma, come look at this." Fear gripped Emma's chest as she hurried toward the house. Inside, she found Lily standing beside the wooden box, the ornate container that held Mr. Hung's tools, with an expression of triumphant discovery rather than distress. "I was looking for a pencil. Grandma said Grandpa had carpenter's pencils in his box, but look what I found." The girl pointed at the bottom of the bedroom, where a thin panel of wood had shifted aside to reveal a hidden compartment. Emma had handled this box dozens of times while borrowing and returning tools. She had never suspected it contained anything beyond the implements visible on its surface. Inside the compartment lay 2 objects wrapped in protective plastic, a small notebook bound in worn leather, and a piece of paper folded into quarters. Mrs. Nguyen appeared in the doorway, and the color drained from her face like water from a broken vessel. 15 years, she whispered. "I kept that box 15 years. Never knew about hidden space." her eyes fixed on the notebook and folded paper as if they were ghosts manifested in physical form. He hid something. Hung hid something and never told me. Together they removed the contents from their concealment. The notebook proved to be a journal written in Vietnamese. Mrs. Nguyen would translate later. Its pages filled with dated entries in a neat handwriting that matched the letters carved into the toolbox's decorative panels. The folded paper was a map, hand-drawn with the precision of someone who understood architectural drafting, depicting the very lot where Emma's shelter now stood. An X marked a specific location at the southeast corner, near the old oak tree that had survived the neighborhood's decline. Mrs. Nguyen read the journal's entries aloud, her voice growing steadier as the story emerged. March 15, 2009. The foundation on Block B is inadequate. I reported this to Peterson, the site supervisor. He informed me that Mr. Harrison demanded we continue regardless of structural concerns. The deadline takes priority over safety. March 22, 2009. Observe cracks in the load-bearing column on floor 1. Photograph documentation. Peterson dismissed my warnings as excessive worry. Harrison will terminate anyone who causes delays, he said. March 28, 2009. They forced all workers to sign liability waivers. Those who refused were fired immediately. I signed it because Mei Ling begins university this year and we need the income. But I am also keeping evidence. Photographs, documents. April 1st, 2009. I have hidden the original evidence, photographs, audio recording of meeting between Peterson and Harrison in a secure location. If something happens to me, Lam will find this journal and know where to look. The map shows the burial site. Under the oak tree on the abandoned lot, 6 feet east of the trunk, 3 feet below the surface. The journal ended there. The floor collapse that killed Nguyen Van Hung occurred on April 5, 2009. 15 years. The evidence had waited 15 years, buried beneath the same ground where Emma had unknowingly chosen to build her shelter, hidden by a man who had known he might not survive his own integrity, who had prepared a legacy of truth for a day when it could finally matter. He knew, Mrs. Nguyen said, her voice barely audible. Hung knew something would happen, and he prepared. Emma looked from the journal to the map to the lot visible through the window. Her lot now, in every way that mattered except legal title. The evidence is still there, she said. Under that oak tree, whatever he buried 15 years ago is still waiting to be found. Lily watched the adults with wide eyes, understanding that something significant was happening, even if the details escaped her. Mrs. Nguyen reached out and drew her granddaughter close, perhaps protecting her from the weight of revelation, perhaps drawing strength from her innocent presence. We need to dig, Emma continued, and we need Frank. Outside, November wind rattled the windows of Mrs. Nguyen's house, carrying the scent of approaching snow. Somewhere in the frozen ground of the Eastern District, a dead man's evidence waited to resurrect his story. Somewhere in a corporate office, William Harrison continued building his empire on foundations of silence and settlement money. Somewhere in hiding, Tyler Harrison nursed whatever guilt or cowardice or calculation had driven him to abandon the mother of his child. The pieces were falling into place. The picture they formed was dark and complicated and dangerous. But Emma Collins had spent the last 2 months building shelter from discarded materials, transforming trash into treasure, creating possibility from abandonment. She had proven that determination could construct what resources could not buy. Now she would build something else, something Harrison and his money and his influence could not demolish. She would build the truth. The shovel bit into frozen November earth with a sound like breaking bones. Frank Morrison worked methodically in the darkness, each thrust deliberate, each scoop of dirt removed and piled with the care of an archaeologist uncovering sacred remains. Moonlight filtered through bare oak branches overhead, casting skeletal shadows across the excavation site. Emma stood beside Mrs. Nguyen at the edge of the growing hole, both women silent, both holding breath they did not realize they were holding. 6 feet east of the trunk, 3 feet deep. The measurements from Hung Nguyen's hand-drawn map proved exact. The precision of a master carpenter translated into coordinates of concealment. At 2 feet 8 inches, Frank's shovel struck something that was not earth. Metal. The unmistakable ring of steel against steel. He dropped to his knees, brushing away soil with gloved hands until a rectangular shape emerged from the darkness. A lockbox, perhaps 12 inches long and 8 inches wide, rusted but intact. Its surface bore the patina of 15 Michigan winters, yet the seams remained sealed, the contents protected by whatever waterproofing Hung Nguyen had applied before burial. Combination lock, Frank observed, lifting the box from its grave. 4 digits. Mrs. Nguyen's voice came as a whisper. Mei Ling's birthday, August 15th, 1985. He used that number for everything. Frank tried the sequence. 0815. Nothing. Then 1508. The lock clicked open. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic sheeting that had yellowed with age but remained watertight, they found the evidence Hung Nguyen had gathered in the final weeks of his life. Approximately 30 photographs documented structural failures at the Maple Avenue construction site, cracked support columns, inadequate foundation depths, safety warnings removed from walls. Each image bore handwritten notations on its reverse, dates, locations, the names of supervisors who had witnessed the violations and chosen silence. A sheaf of documents revealed internal inspection reports with visible alterations. The word fail crossed out in one color ink and replaced with pass in another. Signatures that did not match the inspectors listed. A paper trail of corruption preserved in plastic. And at the bottom of the box, a cassette tape. Its label written in Hung Nguyen's careful script read, Peterson-Harrison meeting, March 25th, 2009. They retreated to Mrs. Nguyen's kitchen, where an ancient cassette player sat on a shelf beside cookbooks and family photographs. The machine had not been used in years, but its mechanism still functioned. Frank inserted the tape with hands that betrayed a slight tremor. Static filled the room, then voices. The first belonged to someone named Peterson, site supervisor, according to the journal entries. His tone carried the nervous energy of a man delivering unwelcome news. The report from Nguyen about the foundation, he's saying it's not safe to continue. The second voice cut through with the authority of absolute power, and Emma recognized it immediately from promotional videos on the Grayfield Development website. William Harrison, CEO and patriarch, speaking with the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced consequences for his decisions. Deadline is deadline. The bank won't wait. We finish on schedule or we all lose money. Peterson's protest came weakly. But if there's an incident, then we have insurance and lawyers. That's what they're for. Keep building. That's an order. What about Nguyen? He's making noise talking to other workers. A pause on the tape, filled with ambient sound, papers shuffling, a chair creaking. Then Harrison's voice again, colder now. Make him sign the waiver like everyone else. If he won't sign, he's fired. There are 100 men waiting for his job. The recording continued for another 10 minutes, documenting discussions of how to bury inspection reports, which officials could be paid to look the other way, how much settlement money would be required if something unfortunate occurred. The voices spoke of human lives as line items on a budget, calculating the cost of silence against the price of delay. When the tape ended, Mrs. Nguyen sat motionless at her kitchen table, tears tracking silently down weathered cheeks. 15 years of imposed silence. 15 years of settlement money that had felt less like compensation and more like blood payment. 15 years believing her husband had died in a tragic accident rather than a preventable catastrophe enabled by corporate greed. They knew, she finally said. Harrison knew the building was dangerous. He ordered them to continue anyway. And 4 days later, my husband was dead. Frank ejected the tape with reverent care. This isn't just evidence of negligence. This is proof of reckless disregard for human life. With this recording, prosecutors could reopen the case. Harrison could face criminal charges, negligent homicide, obstruction of justice, bribery. After 15 years, Emma asked, murder has no statute of limitations in Michigan. And what Harrison did, Frank's jaw tightened. What he did was choose profit over people's lives. That's not an accident. That's a choice. Mrs. Nguyen rose from the table, moving to the cabinet where she kept items too precious for everyday display. She returned with another notebook. Not her husband's journal, but her own, filled with entries spanning more than a decade. After Hung died, I signed their papers, took their money. They said I could never speak of what happened. Her fingers traced the notebook's worn cover. But they could not stop me from listening, from remembering, from writing down what I heard. She opened to the first page, revealing a list that continued for dozens of entries. Names, dates, injuries, settlement amounts, where she had been able to learn them. Every accident at Harrison construction sites since my husband's death. Every worker injured or killed. Every family paid to stay quiet. Her voice hardened into something that could cut glass. 47 names in 15 years. 7 deaths. And these are only the ones I could find through whispers in the community. Through workers who trusted me because they knew what happened to Hung. Emma took the notebook, scanning entries that read like a casualty report from some forgotten war. Carlos Martinez, 2010, scaffolding collapse, spinal fracture, $75,000 settlement. Robert Thompson, 2012, electrical shock, third-degree burns over 40% of his body, $40,000. Adam Kowalski, 2014, wall collapse, deceased, $200,000 to his widow and young daughter. 47 people, Emma breathed, and no one stopped him. Money stops questions. Power stops investigations. Fear stops witnesses. Mrs. Nguyen reclaimed her notebook, holding it against her chest like a shield. But truth waits. Sometimes for 15 years, sometimes longer. But eventually, truth finds its moment. The moment would come sooner than any of them anticipated. 1 week after the excavation, a white SUV bearing the Grayfield Building Department logo appeared outside Emma's shelter. Patricia Webb emerged from the vehicle with the deliberate movements of someone delivering judgment. 55 years old, iron gray hair cropped close, suit jacket buttoned despite the November chill. Her eyes swept across Emma's construction with the clinical assessment of a surgeon examining a tumor. "Miss Collins," the greeting carried no warmth, "I'm conducting an official compliance inspection of this structure." Emma had known this day would come. Frank had warned her that his protection could not last forever, that eventually his superiors would notice his delayed enforcement and demand accountability. But knowing something intellectually and facing it physically were different experiences entirely. The structure has been inspected multiple times by Inspector Morrison. Inspector Morrison's reports are under review. Webb's interruption was sharp as a blade. His judgment in this matter has been questioned. I'm here to conduct an independent assessment. The inspection lasted 45 minutes. Webb documented every code violation with photographs and notes, her tablet filling with evidence of Emma's transgressions. Construction without permit, occupation of private property, inadequate electrical systems, insufficient plumbing, failure to meet residential zoning requirements. The list grew longer with each circuit of the shelter, a legal indictment built brick by brick. "Ms. Collins, are you aware that this property belongs to Grayfield Development Group?" "I'm aware the land has been abandoned for years. Ownership does not expire through neglect." Webb's gaze found Emma's pregnant belly, lingered there briefly, then returned to her tablet. "Standard procedure would be immediate condemnation with a 30-day eviction notice. Given your condition, I may recommend a 60-day window. But I cannot ignore violations of this magnitude indefinitely." She departed without further conversation, leaving Emma standing in the doorway of the home she had built with her own hands, watching the white SUV disappear around the corner. Frank arrived that evening with a face that looked as though it had aged a decade in hours. "Webb called me into her office this afternoon," he said without preamble. "She's been reviewing my inspection reports for the past 3 months. Every property where I delayed enforcement, every extension I granted, every violation I chose to document but not act upon." He sank onto the wooden chair Emma had salvaged from a demolished church. "I've been suspended. 2 weeks pending full investigation into conduct unbecoming a city inspector. Because of me. Because I showed her copies of the documents from Hung's box." Frank's hands clenched into fists. I thought it maybe if she understood what Harrison had done, if she saw the evidence of corruption in her own department, but she already knew. She's been part of it for years. Emma processed this revelation, adding another piece to the puzzle taking shape in her mind. Webb is on Harrison's payroll. Has been since at least 2012, based on what I found in the inspection archives before they locked me out of the system. Every Harrison project approved without proper review. Every complaint about safety violations buried. Every inspector who asked too many questions transferred or terminated. Frank's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. They suspended me because I started asking the right questions. The evidence I showed Webb, that wasn't a wake-up call. That was a warning that someone was getting too close to the truth. The conspiracy extended further than Emma had imagined. Not just one greedy developer cutting corners, but a network of complicity woven through the city's infrastructure. Inspectors and officials, and perhaps politicians, all feeding from Harrison's hand, all invested in maintaining the silence that protected him. "We need to go public," Emma said, "before they can bury this like they've buried everything else." Frank nodded slowly. "I know a reporter, Michelle Torres at the Gazette. She's been investigating housing inequality in Grayfield for months. I think she'd be very interested in what we found." Michelle Torres was 32 years old with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, the kind of journalist who had survived layoffs and budget cuts and ownership changes because she produced stories that mattered. She arrived at Emma's shelter 3 days after Frank's suspension, digital recorder in hand, notebook bristling with questions. The interview lasted 4 hours. Emma recounted her journey from abandonment to construction, careful to omit any mention of Tyler's identity or her knowledge of his connection to Harrison. Mrs. Nguyen shared her husband's story, the first time she had spoken publicly about his death in 15 years. Violation of the NDA be damned. Frank provided context about the patterns he had observed in the building department, the suspicious approvals, the buried complaints. "This is explosive," Michelle said when the recording finally stopped. "But Harrison has lawyers, expensive ones. If we publish without ironclad documentation, they'll bury us in defamation suits before the ink dries. We have documentation." Emma retrieved copies of the photographs, the altered inspection reports, the cassette tape transcribed into text. "We have 15 years of evidence that Hung Nguyen gathered because he knew someone might need it someday." Michelle studied the materials with the focused intensity of a predator assessing prey. "When does Emma's variance hearing happen?" 2 weeks, Frank answered. "Then we coordinate. Story breaks 1 week before the hearing, gives it time to spread, builds public pressure. Video component. We need visuals to make this real for people who've never set foot in Grayfield." The video component came from an unexpected source. Alex Cooper was a graduate student in urban planning at Michigan State, 26 years old, working on a thesis about housing inequality in post-industrial communities. He had been documenting Grayfield's Eastern District for months, capturing the decay and displacement that characterized neighborhoods abandoned by capital and forgotten by policy. Emma's shelter had appeared in his footage almost by accident. The pregnant woman building a home from salvage, a visual metaphor too powerful to ignore. Frank had encountered Alex during one of his unauthorized visits to Emma's property, recognized the potential in the young man's project, and quietly cultivated a relationship. When the time came to amplify Emma's story beyond local newspaper coverage, Alex was ready. "The video needs to tell itself," Alex explained during a planning session in Mrs. Nguyen's kitchen. "No narrator pushing conclusions, just images. Emma working on her shelter. The contrast between what she's building and what Harrison wants to build. The community that's formed around her. Let viewers draw their own conclusions about who deserves support." The footage he had already gathered was remarkable. Emma in silhouette against a sunset, hammer in hand. Mrs. Nguyen demonstrating a woodworking technique while Lily watched with rapt attention. Frank and Emma reviewing building codes by lantern light. The shelter growing from skeleton to structure across weeks of patient labor. "When do we release it?" Emma asked, suddenly aware that she was losing control of her own narrative, becoming a symbol in someone else's story. Same day as Michelle's article, maximum impact. Alex's enthusiasm was genuine but unsettling. "This could go national, Emma. Your story could change how people think about housing and homelessness in corporate development. I just wanted a place for my baby to be born." Mrs. Nguyen placed a weathered hand over Emma's. "Sometimes we build more than we intend. Hung only wanted to protect his family. Instead, he left evidence that might bring down an empire." Her eyes held wisdom earned through suffering. "You cannot choose what your actions mean to others. You can only choose to act." The video went live on a Tuesday morning, the same hour Michelle's article appeared on the Gazette's website. Within 6 hours, views exceeded 2 million. By nightfall, the number had doubled. Hashtags proliferated across platforms. Hashtag Justice for Grayfield, Hush Emma's House, Harrison Lies. News outlets from Detroit to New York requested interviews. Politicians who had never heard of Grayfield suddenly discovered urgent concerns about housing policy and corporate accountability. Emma watched the explosion from Mrs. Nguyen's living room, her own face staring back from countless screens, her story told and retold and interpreted by strangers who had never smelled the sawdust, or felt the cold, or known the terror of having nowhere to go. "Are you ready for this?" Frank asked, standing beside her as another notification pinged. "No." Emma's hand rested on her belly, where the baby, 26 weeks now, kicked with increasing insistence. "But I don't think ready matters anymore." William Harrison arrived 48 hours after the video's release. His black SUV pulled up to Emma's shelter like a hearse arriving at a funeral, all dark glass and polished menace. Two men emerged. Harrison himself, silver-haired and immaculate in a charcoal overcoat that cost more than Emma had earned in 6 months at the coffee shop, and a younger man in a lawyer's conservative suit carrying a leather briefcase thick with documents. Emma stood in her doorway, refusing to step outside and meet them on neutral ground. This was her territory now, built with her hands, defended with her determination. If Harrison wanted to threaten her, he would do so in her home. "Miss Collins," Harrison's voice was precisely modulated, the product of decades spent commanding boardrooms and courtrooms in any other room he chose to enter. "I believe we should talk." "Then talk." His lips curved into something that might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. "You've created quite a situation. My public relations team has been working overtime since your little video appeared." He glanced around the shelter with an expression of cultivated disdain. "Impressive in its way, building something from nothing, a talent I can appreciate. You didn't come here to compliment my construction skills." "No, going." Harrison stepped closer, close enough that Emma could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle, the scent of money. "I came to offer you an opportunity. My company is prepared to provide you with a 2-bedroom apartment, 2 years of rent prepaid, plus $50,000 in relocation assistance, enough to give your child a proper start in life. In exchange for what? Vacating this property within 1 week, withdrawing any variance applications, and signing an agreement that you will not make any further public statements about Grayfield Development Group or any members of my family." Emma let the offer hang in the air between them, examining it for hidden teeth. "You're scared. The video, the article, they're hurting you more than you expected. I'm a businessman making a reasonable offer to resolve a difficult situation. What you're doing here is illegal, Miss Collins. My company owns this land. We have every right to develop it as we see fit. Your company killed Hung Nguyen." Emma watched Harrison's face for any reaction, any crack in the polished facade, ignored safety warnings, ordered construction to continue on an unstable foundation, then paid his widow to stay quiet about it. Those are serious allegations, allegations that, if repeated publicly, would expose you to significant legal liability. I have a recording. Harrison ordering the site supervisor to continue building despite knowing the risks. Your voice, your words, documenting your decision to prioritize profit over human lives. For the first time since his arrival, something shifted in Harrison's expression. Not fear exactly. Men like him had spent too long accumulating power to fear easily, but calculation. Reassessment of an opponent who had revealed unexpected weapons. "You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Collins. I have resources you cannot imagine. Lawyers, political connections, the ability to make problems disappear. Whatever you think you have on me, I can counter it 100 different ways." "Then why are you here offering me money?" The question landed like a slap. Harrison's composure flickered, just for an instant, before reassembling itself into cold authority. "Because I prefer elegant solutions, clean resolutions that benefit everyone involved." He stepped even closer, voice dropping to something almost intimate. "You have a baby coming, a child who deserves better than to be born in a shack built from garbage, while her mother fights a war she cannot win. Take my offer. Give your daughter a real life instead of a symbol. Emma felt the truth of his words even as she rejected them. Her child did deserve better. But better could not be built on silence, on complicity, on accepting money from the man whose negligence had orphaned other children. 47 people, she said quietly, injured or killed at your construction sites over 15 years. 7 deaths. How much silence does $50,000 buy for all of them? Harrison's mask finally cracked. His voice, when it came, carried the cold fury of a man unaccustomed to defiance. You have 72 hours to reconsider. After that, the offer expires and we proceed through other channels. Channels you will find considerably less pleasant. He turned and walked back to his SUV without waiting for response. The vehicle pulled away, leaving Emma standing in the doorway of her shelter, trembling with adrenaline and something that might have been triumph. She had looked into the face of the man who had destroyed so many lives and refused to blink first. The public hearing convened 1 week later in Grayfield City Hall, a building that had once symbolized civic pride and now served mainly as a monument to better days. The main chamber, designed to hold perhaps 200 citizens, overflowed with more than 400. People stood in aisles, crowded doorways, spilled into hallways where mounted speakers broadcast the proceedings. Television cameras from 3 networks occupied the back of the room, their lights creating islands of artificial brightness in the institutional gloom. Emma sat at a table designated for public comment, 28 weeks pregnant now, her belly prominent beneath the maternity dress Mrs. Nguyen had purchased for this occasion. Frank Morrison occupied the chair beside her, officially still suspended but present as a citizen exercising his right to attend public meetings. Behind them, filling the first 3 rows of public seating, sat the people who had become her community. Nguyen and Lily, Maria Kowalski, whose father had died in the 2014 wall collapse, Carlos Martinez in his wheelchair, families of other Harrison victims who had emerged from 15 years of mandated silence. William Harrison sat at the opposite table, flanked by 3 lawyers whose combined hourly rate exceeded Emma's annual income from her barista job. His expression suggested a man attending a minor inconvenience rather than a reckoning. The meeting had been scheduled to discuss the Eastern District Development Plan, routine city business transformed by viral video and newspaper investigation into something approaching public trial. Council members who had rubber-stamped Harrison projects for years now asked pointed questions about affordable housing requirements. Citizens who had never attended a public meeting rose to share stories of displacement and demolition. The mood in the chamber crackled with energy that felt almost revolutionary. When Emma's turn came to speak, she rose slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle onto her shoulders like a mantle. My name is Emma Collins. 3 months ago, I was homeless, pregnant and abandoned and sleeping under a tarp in an empty lot because every shelter was full and every housing program had an 18-month waiting list. Her voice carried clearly through the microphone, steady despite the cameras and the crowd and the cold eyes of William Harrison watching from across the chamber. So I did the only thing I could do. I built. She described the shelter, the scavenging, the slow transformation of discarded materials into something that could withstand Michigan winters. She spoke of Mrs. Nguyen's guidance and Frank Morrison's technical assistance and the community that had formed around her desperate improvisation. I'm not here today to ask for charity. I'm here to speak truth about an empire built on blood. From her folder, Emma withdrew a single sheet of paper, a copy of Mrs. Nguyen's list, 47 names typed in stark black letters. Grayfield Development Group, under the leadership of William Harrison, has caused or covered up 47 workplace accidents in 15 years. 7 workers died. 40 more were injured, some permanently disabled. Their families were paid to sign agreements never to speak publicly about what happened. Silence purchased with settlement checks. She began reading names. Nguyen Van Hung, 2009, floor collapse, deceased. Carlos Martinez, 2010, scaffolding failure, paralyzed from the waist down. Robert Thompson, 2012, electrical fire, burns over 40% of his body. Each name landed in the chamber like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples spreading outward through the assembled crowd. Council members shifted uncomfortably. Journalists scribbled furiously. Harrison's lawyers whispered urgent consultations. Adam Kowalski, 2014, wall collapse, deceased. His daughter Maria is here today, sitting behind me. She was 6 years old when Harrison's negligence took her father. A woman in the audience stood, Maria Kowalski, 30 years old now, tears streaming down her face but chin lifted in defiance. She said nothing, needed to say nothing. Her presence was testimony enough. Emma continued reading. Name after name, injury after injury, a litany of broken bodies and silenced voices spanning a decade and a half of corporate indifference. She had reached the 23rd name when William Harrison rose from his seat. This is slander. His voice, usually so controlled, cracked with fury. Unsubstantiated accusations from a woman illegally squatting on my company's property. I demand, I have a recording. Emma cut through his outrage with 4 words that silenced the chamber. A cassette tape made by Hung Nguyen 4 days before his death. Your voice, Mr. Harrison, ordering construction to continue despite warnings that the foundation was unsafe. She quoted from memory, each word seared into her consciousness from repeated listening. Deadline is deadline. The bank won't wait. Keep building. That's an order. Harrison's face, already flushed with anger, went white. You can't have. 4 days later, the floor collapsed. 3 workers were buried. Hung Nguyen died protecting a younger worker, pushing him out of the way. The other man survived with injuries. Nguyen was crushed under a ton of concrete that your deadline deemed more important than proper construction. Harrison moved then, pushing past his lawyers, striding toward Emma with fury radiating from every step. You will regret this. I will destroy you. I will take everything you have built and grind it into dust. Security guards intercepted him 3 feet from Emma's table. Cameras captured everything. The CEO of Grayfield's largest development company physically threatening a pregnant woman in a public government meeting. The footage would appear on national news within hours. Remove Mr. Harrison from the chamber, the council president ordered, her voice tight with barely contained shock. This hearing is recessed until order can be restored. As guards escorted Harrison towards a side exit, he turned back to Emma one final time. His eyes held something beyond anger, a recognition, perhaps, that the walls he had built from money and influence and manufactured silence were finally beginning to crack. The video of Harrison's outburst accumulated 12 million views in its first 24 hours. Stock in Grayfield Development Group dropped 18% before trading was temporarily suspended. The FBI contacted local prosecutors to discuss potential federal charges. Patricia Webb, the building inspector who had suspended Frank Morrison, was herself suspended pending investigation into her relationship with Harrison Companies. But Emma had no time to savor these victories. The stress of the confrontation had triggered Braxton Hicks' contractions more severe than any she had experienced before. She spent the night after the hearing in the hospital, hooked to monitors that tracked her heart rate and the baby's, while doctors warned her that continued stress could precipitate premature labor. You need to rest, the attending physician told her bluntly. Your body is telling you it's reached its limits. The pregnancy is progressing normally, but you're running on empty. If you don't slow down, your baby may arrive before she's ready. Rest felt like luxury Emma could not afford. The variance hearing was scheduled for the following week. Evidence needed to be organized. Witnesses needed to be prepared. The momentum generated by the public confrontation needed to be channeled into concrete legal outcomes. But her body had its own agenda. She spent 3 days in Mrs. Nguyen's guest room, venturing outside only for brief walks recommended by her doctor. Lily read to her from children's books, providing distraction and undemanding companionship. Frank brought updates on the investigation's progress. Mrs. Nguyen cooked meals designed to restore strength and ensure the baby received proper nutrition. It was during this enforced convalescence that Tyler Harrison finally reappeared. He came on the 4th day, materializing at Mrs. Nguyen's door like a ghost from Emma's previous life. 8 months since his departure. 8 months of silence and abandonment and unanswered questions. Now he stood on the porch of the woman whose husband his father's negligence had killed, asking to speak with the woman he had left pregnant and alone. Mrs. Nguyen's face hardened into something ancient and implacable when she recognized him. You have nerve coming here. I know. Tyler's voice carried none of the confidence Emma remembered. He looked diminished somehow, thinner, darker circles under his eyes. the expensive clothes replaced by ordinary jeans and a plain jacket. "I need to talk to Emma, please." Emma appeared behind Mrs. Nguyen, one hand braced against the doorframe for support. "Let him in." They sat in Mrs. Nguyen's living room, Tyler on the edge of a chair as if expecting to be expelled at any moment, Emma on the sofa with a pillow supporting her back. Mrs. Nguyen remained standing in the doorway, arms crossed, radiating protective fury. Tyler spoke first, words tumbling out in a rush that suggested they had been building for months. "My father called a family meeting yesterday. He's transferring all his shares in the company to my brother Marcus, cutting me out of everything. The inheritance, the trust funds, the family properties, all going to Marcus. You came here to tell me about your inheritance problems." "I came because he's doing it to punish me." Tyler's hands twisted together in his lap. "For you, for getting involved with you, for creating a vulnerability that's now bringing down everything he built." Emma processed this information, searching for the relevance to her own situation. "So you're here because your father cut you off, not because you care about me or the baby." "I'm here because—" Tyler stopped, started again. "When I left, I was scared, not just of being a father, though that too, but of what my father would do if he found out. You have no idea what he's capable of, what he's done to people who threatened his interests. I have 47 names that suggest I do." Tyler flinched. "Those were accidents. Negligence, yes. Covered up, definitely. But my father didn't set out to kill anyone. He just didn't care enough to prevent it. There's a difference. Tell that to Maria Kowalski. Tell it to Mrs. Nguyen." Silence stretched between them, heavy with accumulated grievance. When Tyler spoke again, his voice had dropped to something barely audible. "I have something that might help you." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a USB drive, placing it on the coffee table between them. "Backup files from my father's private server, emails, financial records, meeting notes, including documentation of payments to Patricia Webb and 2 city council members who've been approving Harrison projects for years." Emma looked at the device without touching it. "Why would you give this to me?" "Because my father destroyed my life to protect his empire. Because I spent 32 years trying to earn his approval, and he threw me away the moment I became inconvenient." Tyler's voice hardened with something that sounded almost like hatred. "Because if his empire is going to burn anyway, I want to be the one who lights the final match. This isn't about helping me, it's about revenge." "Does it matter?" Tyler met her eyes directly for the first time since entering the room. "You need evidence to bring him down. I have evidence. My motives don't change what's on that drive." Emma considered the offer, weighing the tainted source against the potential value of its contents. Tyler had not come seeking redemption or reconciliation. He had not asked about the baby, had not apologized for his abandonment, had not shown any interest in the life he had helped create. He was here because his father had hurt him, and hurting his father in return was the only response he could imagine. Some tools are dirty, she thought, but sometimes dirty tools are the only ones that can dig deep enough. "What about the baby?" she asked quietly. Tyler's gaze flickered to her belly, then away. "I'll sign whatever papers you want, give up parental rights, or contribute financially if you prefer. Whatever you decide." He stood abruptly, as if the topic had become too uncomfortable to pursue. "I'm not asking to be part of her life. I just wanted you to have the ammunition you need." He left without farewell, the USB drive remaining on the coffee table like a grenade with the pin removed. Mrs. Nguyen watched him go with an expression that mixed contempt with something approaching pity. "His father made him," she observed when the door closed. "Made him weak, made him scared, made him selfish. Harrison builds broken things, broken buildings, broken people." Emma picked up the USB drive, feeling its weight in her palm. Broken things can still be useful. Sometimes more useful because they were broken. The contents of Tyler's drive exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Rebecca Stone, the housing rights attorney who had joined Emma's legal team pro bono, reviewed the files with growing astonishment over the following 48 hours. Payment records showing monthly transfers to Patricia Webb totaling over $150,000 across a decade. Emails between Harrison and city council members discussing how to fast-track development approvals. internal memos acknowledging safety violations and calculating the cost-benefit of addressing them versus paying settlements. This is a RICO case, Rebecca declared during an emergency strategy session. Racketeering, bribery, conspiracy to obstruct justice. Federal prosecutors are going to have a field day. The evidence was forwarded to the FBI agents who had already begun preliminary investigation based on the public hearing's revelations. Simultaneously, copies went to Michelle Torres for a follow-up story that would ensure public pressure continued building toward the variance hearing. Emma, 32 weeks pregnant now, divided her attention between legal preparation and medical monitoring. The Braxton Hicks contractions had subsided but not disappeared. Her doctor recommended reduced activity and stress management, recommendations that felt almost laughable given the circumstances. The variance hearing was 4 days away, 4 days to organize testimony, 4 days to coordinate with attorneys and journalists and the coalition of supporters who had coalesced around her cause, 4 days to prepare for a confrontation that would determine whether she could keep the home she had built or watch it demolished to make room for luxury condominiums most Grayfield residents could never afford. "You need to rest," Frank told her during an evening planning session at her shelter. "Let us handle the preparation. You've done the hard part, building this place, gathering the evidence, standing up to Harrison in public. Now let others carry some of the weight." Emma looked around the small space she had constructed from discarded materials. The walls stood straighter now, properly braced and insulated against the coming winter. The roof no longer leaked. A small solar panel provided enough electricity for lights and phone charging. Mrs. Nguyen's late husband's tools hung on pegs she had installed with her own hands. This was her home, not because it was comfortable or convenient or up to code, because she had built it when no one else would, because she had transformed rejection into creation, abandonment into determination. "I can't rest," she admitted. "Not until this is over. Not until I know whether she'll be born with a roof over her head or on the streets." Frank sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Whatever happens at the hearing, Emma, whatever the variance board decides, you've already won something. You proved it's possible to build shelter from nothing. You showed people that housing is a right worth fighting for, not just a commodity to be bought and sold. Words don't keep rain out. No, but they change minds, and change minds eventually change policies." He was quiet for a moment. "I grew up sleeping in a car with my mother. She died because we couldn't afford health care, couldn't afford a home, couldn't afford any of the things that keep people alive in this country. For 25 years, I've been trying to fix that broken system from the inside, following rules written by people who never experienced what we experienced." He turned to face her directly, something shifting in his expression. "You showed me that sometimes the rules need to be broken before they can be rebuilt. That's not nothing. That's everything." The night before the variance hearing, Emma stood alone in her shelter, listening to wind whisper through gaps that still needed sealing. The baby was active tonight, kicking and rolling, as if sensing the momentous events approaching. Emma placed both hands on her belly and spoke softly to the life within. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know something. You were wanted. From the moment I knew you existed, I wanted you. I built this place for you. I fought these battles for you, not because I'm brave or special, but because you deserve better than what the world was offering." She thought of Mrs. Nguyen, who had lost a husband and kept his secrets, and finally found the courage to break 15 years of imposed silence. Of Frank, carrying childhood trauma into a career built on trying to protect others from similar suffering. Of the 47 names on Mrs. Nguyen's list, each one representing a family shattered by corporate indifference. "We build what we can with what we have," she whispered to her unborn daughter. "Sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes the storms are stronger than our walls. But we build anyway, because the building matters, because the trying matters, because giving up is the only failure that can't be recovered from." Through the window, she could see lights in Mrs. Nguyen's house, the old woman preparing for tomorrow's hearing. Lily probably already asleep in the guest room, unaware of the battles being fought around her. Beyond, the empty lots of the Eastern District stretched toward Grayfield's distant glow. Land that Harrison claimed to own, but that had belonged to this community long before his money arrived. Tomorrow would determine many things: whether Emma's shelter would stand or fall, whether Harrison would face accountability for decades of negligence, whether the voices of 47 injured and killed workers would finally be heard in a form that mattered. But tonight there was only this moment. A pregnant woman standing in a home she had built from nothing. A child growing in her womb who would inherit either victory or defeat. A community of broken people finding strength in shared struggle. Whatever came with mourning, Emma knew she would face it the way she had faced everything else since Tyler's abandonment. By building. By refusing to accept that circumstances were permanent. By transforming what was discarded into something new. The wind shifted outside, carrying the first bitter edge of approaching winter. Snow would come soon, real snow, the heavy Michigan accumulation that would test every joint and seal and structural decision she had made over the past 3 months. But tonight her walls held. Her roof kept out the cold. Her determination remained intact. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. Emma Collins was ready to meet it. The variance hearing convened at 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning in early December, snow falling in lazy spirals outside the windows of Grayfield's municipal building. The main council chamber had been configured for formal proceedings, with a raised dais for the 5-member variance board, tables for petitioners and respondents, and public seating that filled to capacity an hour before the scheduled start. Television cameras occupied positions along the walls, their operators adjusting focus and lighting for optimal coverage of what had become the most anticipated municipal hearing in Grayfield's history. Emma sat at the petitioner's table, 33 weeks pregnant, her belly straining against the navy blue maternity dress Mrs. Nguyen had insisted she wear. Rebecca Stone occupied the chair beside her, legal documents arranged in meticulous order, strategy notes highlighted and tabbed. Behind them, filling the first 4 rows of public seating, sat the community that had coalesced around Emma's cause. Nguyen with Lily pressed close to her side, Frank Morrison in civilian clothes rather than his inspector's uniform, Maria Kowalski and Carlos Martinez, and a dozen other victims or family members of Harrison's negligence. The opposing table presented a different picture entirely. 3 attorneys from a Chicago firm, specialists in property law and municipal regulation, sat with matching briefcases and matching expressions of professional detachment. William Harrison was conspicuously absent from the chamber, though Emma had spotted his black SUV in the parking lot when she arrived. Board chairwoman Eleanor Vance, a former real estate attorney in her 60s with silver hair and a reputation for procedural precision, called the hearing to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. We are here to consider a variance application filed on behalf of Emma Collins regarding the property located at 847 Eastern District, currently owned by Grayfield Development Group. The petitioner seeks permission to maintain an existing residential structure pending resolution of broader housing and safety concerns. The Grayfield Development attorneys presented their case first, as respondents with priority. Their arguments were technically competent and emotionally hollow. Property rights, zoning regulations, investment expectations, the disruption to development timelines that an extended variance would create. They produced surveys and projections and expert analyses, all demonstrating the economic rationale for proceeding with planned demolition. None of it mentioned the 47 injured workers. None of it acknowledged the 7 deaths. None of it addressed the evidence of systematic corruption that had emerged over the preceding weeks. When Emma's turn came, Rebecca Stone rose to deliver opening remarks. Chairwoman Vance, board members, we are not here today simply to discuss zoning variances and property lines. We are here because my client built a home when no other option existed, and in doing so uncovered evidence of criminal conduct that has endangered this community for 15 years. The chamber doors opened before Rebecca could continue. 2 men in dark suits entered with the measured pace of those accustomed to commanding attention without demanding it. Emma recognized the lead figure from news coverage of federal investigations. Marcus Thompson, FBI special agent in charge for the Detroit field office. Chairwoman Vance, Agent Thompson's voice carried the quiet authority of federal power. I apologize for the interruption. I need to speak with you privately before these proceedings continue. The chairwoman's expression shifted from annoyance to concern as she assessed the gravity in Thompson's demeanor. This hearing is in session, Agent. Whatever you need to discuss, it directly affects the respondent in this case. I strongly recommend a brief recess. A murmur rippled through the packed chamber. The Grayfield development attorneys exchanged glances that suggested they had not anticipated this intervention. Emma felt her heart rate accelerate, the baby responding to her tension with a flurry of movement. Chairwoman Vance deliberated for a moment, then nodded. 15-minute recess. Agent Thompson, my office, please. The recess stretched to 45 minutes. Speculation filled the chamber like rising water. Whispered theories about arrests and indictments, about evidence that had finally reached critical mass, about the empire of silence finally crumbling. Emma sat motionless at the petitioner's table, Rebecca's hand on her arm providing anchor against the chaos of uncertainty. When the board members finally returned to their seats, their expressions had transformed. Whatever Agent Thompson had shared in that private meeting had fundamentally altered their understanding of the case before them. This hearing will resume, Chairwoman Vance announced, her voice carefully neutral. However, I must inform all parties that circumstances have changed significantly since we began. Agent Thompson has requested permission to address the chamber before we proceed with testimony. Thompson took a position at the center of the room and facing both tables and the assembled public with equal directness. Ladies and gentlemen, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has completed a preliminary review of evidence related to Grayfield Development Group and its principal officers. Based on this review, arrest warrants have been issued for William Robert Harrison on charges of negligent homicide, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and bribery of public officials. The chamber erupted. Journalists typed frantically on laptops. Camera operators swung their equipment toward Thompson. The Grayfield development attorneys huddled in urgent consultation. Somewhere in the public seating, someone began to cry. Relief or vindication or the release of years of suppressed grief. Additionally, Thompson continued over the noise, warrants have been issued for Patricia Webb, former senior building inspector for the city of Grayfield, and for city council members Theodore Davis and Carmen Martinez, all on charges related to the same conspiracy. Emma felt the room tilt around her. 15 years of buried truth finally exhumed. 47 names finally acknowledged. The recording Hung Nguyen had made in the final days of his life, finally serving the purpose he had intended. Mr. Harrison is currently in the building, Thompson added. Federal agents are executing the arrest warrant as we speak. As if summoned by his words, the chamber's side door opened. William Harrison entered flanked by 2 FBI agents, his wrists secured in handcuffs, his silver hair disheveled for the first time in any of Emma's encounters with him. His eyes swept the room, finding his attorneys, finding the board members, finally finding Emma at the petitioner's table. The rage in his expression should have frightened her. Instead, Emma felt something shift and settle in her chest, a weight she had not realized she was carrying, finally releasing its grip. This was the man who had ordered construction to continue on an unstable foundation, who had chosen profit over the lives of workers, who had paid for silence and threatened those who would not be bought. Now he walked past in handcuffs, escorted toward a future that would include courtrooms and cells and the systematic dismantling of everything he had built on foundations of lies. This is not over. Harrison's voice cut through the case as he passed Emma's table. You think you've won something, but you have no idea what you've started. My lawyers will— Mr. Harrison, Agent Thompson's interruption was calm and absolute. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly recommend you exercise it. They led him through a rear exit, cameras capturing every step of his departure. The man who had threatened Emma in her own home, who had built an empire on broken bodies and buried complaints, who had believed his money and power placed him beyond accountability. That man was gone, replaced by a defendant facing federal prosecution. Chairwoman Vance allowed 5 minutes for the chamber to settle before resuming. Given these developments, I believe the board should hear directly from the petitioner before we deliberate. Ms. Collins, if you are prepared to testify. Emma rose from her chair, steadying herself against a wave of dizziness that the morning's stress had intensified. The baby was active, seemingly aware of the significance of the moment, kicking against her ribs as if demanding attention. 3 months ago, I was homeless. Her voice emerged stronger than she expected, carrying across the chamber without amplification. I had been abandoned by someone I trusted, evicted from my apartment, turned away from every shelter and housing program in this city. I slept under a tarp in an empty lot because there was literally nowhere else for me to go. She described the building process in terms the board could understand: the research at the public library, the scavenging for materials, the gradual transformation of debris into shelter. She spoke of Mrs. Nguyen's guidance and Frank Morrison's technical assistance, of the community that had formed around her desperate improvisation. I did not set out to uncover corruption or expose criminal negligence. I set out to build a home for my child. But in doing so, I discovered that the land I had chosen, land abandoned by its corporate owner for years, contained evidence of something that demanded to be told. She detailed the discovery of Hung Nguyen's hidden evidence, the journal entries documenting his final weeks, the recording that captured Harrison ordering construction to continue despite known risks. She recited names from Mrs. Nguyen's list, not all 47, but enough to establish the pattern, the systematic disregard for human life that had characterized Harrison's operations for 15 years. The man who was just arrested built his fortune on the bodies of working people. He paid for their silence when he could, threatened them when he couldn't, and buried the evidence of his crimes under layers of money and influence. But he made a mistake. He assumed that everyone could be bought or intimidated. He assumed that the truth, once buried, would stay buried forever. Emma paused, feeling another wave of dizziness wash through her. The baby kicked sharply, a sensation that felt less like movement and more like warning. But truth has a way of finding its moment. Sometimes it takes 15 years. Sometimes it takes a desperate woman with nothing to lose building a shelter from garbage. But eventually truth rises, and when it does, all the money and power and influence in the world cannot push it back down. She meant to continue, to address the variance application directly, to make the case for why her shelter should be allowed to remain while proper housing was secured. But the dizziness intensified, became something that was not mere lightheadedness, but genuine distress. Her hand found the edge of the table for support as the room began to spin. "Emma," Rebecca's voice sharp with concern, "are you all right?" The answer came not in words but in sensation, a tightening across her abdomen more intense than any Braxton Hicks contraction she had experienced, followed by a sudden warmth spreading down her inner thighs. Her water had broken. At 33 weeks, nearly 7 weeks before her due date, her body had decided it could no longer wait. "I need—" The words dissolved into a gasp as another contraction seized her. "The baby is coming." Chaos erupted for the second time that morning, but this chaos was different, urgent with genuine emergency rather than political drama. Frank reached her first, his arm around her waist providing support as her legs threatened to buckle. Mrs. Nguyen was calling for an ambulance. Rebecca was clearing a path through the crowd of reporters and spectators who had surged toward the petitioner's table. "Someone get a doctor!" Chairwoman Vance's voice cut through the confusion. "Is there a medical professional in the chamber?" A woman in the back row, later identified as an off-duty nurse who had attended out of curiosity about the Harrison case, pushed through to Emma's side. She assessed the situation with practiced efficiency. Contractions approximately 4 minutes apart. Water broken. Mother in distress. "We need to get her to the hospital now. This baby isn't waiting for paperwork." They transported Emma by ambulance, Frank riding beside her while Mrs. Nguyen followed in her own vehicle with Lily. The contractions came faster as they traveled, each one a tightening vice that left Emma gasping for breath between waves of pain. "You're going to be fine." Frank held her hand with the intensity of someone clinging to a lifeline. "The doctors will take care of you, both of you. The hearing doesn't matter right now. Nothing matters except you and Grace." Grace, the name they had chosen together in Mrs. Nguyen's kitchen one evening, discussing the future as if it were certain rather than precarious. A name that meant favor and blessing and the gift of something unearned. Now that name might arrive 7 weeks early, rushing into the world before the variance board had rendered its decision, before the home Emma had built could be confirmed or condemned. The hospital was a blur of fluorescent lights and urgent voices. Emma was rushed to the labor and delivery ward, where doctors assessed her condition with grave efficiency. Premature labor at 33 weeks, not catastrophic, but concerning. They administered medications to slow the contractions, hooked her to monitors that tracked her vital signs and the baby's heartbeat, explained risks and probabilities in the detached language of medical protocol. "We may be able to stop the labor," the attending physician told her during a brief window of relative calm. "Keep you pregnant for another few days or weeks, but your body has been under tremendous stress. The labor may progress despite our interventions." The hours that followed existed outside normal time. Contractions ebbed and flowed, sometimes responding to medication, sometimes surging past pharmaceutical barriers with painful insistence. Frank stayed at her bedside until nurses firmly suggested he take a break. Mrs. Nguyen replaced him. Lily eventually sent home with a neighbor. The rotation of support continuous throughout the night. News from the outside world filtered in through phone updates and hushed conversations. The variance hearing had been suspended pending Emma's medical situation. William Harrison had been denied bail due to flight risk, his private jet and overseas accounts suggesting he might flee jurisdiction. Patricia Webb and the two council members were in custody, all declining to make statements on advice of their attorneys. But the news that mattered most arrived the following morning, delivered by Frank with an expression that mixed concern with something approaching awe. "They're at your shelter," he said, sitting beside her bed as monitors beeped their steady rhythms. "I drove by on my way here. Dozens of people, neighbors, supporters, strangers who saw the videos. They formed a chain around the property. Harrison's company sent workers to begin site preparation. Apparently someone in their organization decided to proceed despite the arrests, and the community blocked them." Emma struggled to sit up, wires and tubes limiting her movement. "They're protecting my home?" Standing in a circle around it, refusing to let anyone approach. Police arrived but didn't intervene. Too much media attention, too much public sympathy. The workers eventually left. Frank showed her his phone, a photo of the human chain, Maria Kowalski at the front, Carlos Martinez in his wheelchair, Miss Robinson the librarian, dozens of others whose faces Emma did not recognize, but whose presence spoke louder than any testimony. She sank back against her pillows, something breaking loose in her chest that she had not realized was held together by tension and fear. These strangers, these community members who had never slept in her shelter, never shared her meals, never experienced her particular desperation, they were standing in Michigan winter to protect what she had built. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why would they do this for me?" Mrs. Nguyen's answer came from the doorway where she had been listening without announcement. "Because you built something that matters, not just shelter, symbol, proof that ordinary people can create what systems deny them." She entered and took the chair on Emma's other side. Hung would have understood. Sometimes we build more than we intend. Sometimes the building itself becomes the message. Labor intensified that afternoon, breaking through the pharmaceutical barriers doctors had erected. By evening, it became clear that Grace would not wait for the world to organize itself properly. She was coming, ready or not, 7 weeks early, but determined. The delivery room became its own kind of battlefield. Emma pushed through pain that transcended anything she had imagined, her body working toward a goal that felt both natural and impossible. Mrs. Nguyen held one hand, a nurse held the other. Frank waited in the hallway, pacing the same path worn smooth by generations of anxious fathers and friends. At 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday in early December, Grace Collins entered the world. She weighed 4 pounds, 11 ounces, small but vigorous, her cry cutting through the delivery room with a clarity that seemed to announce her intention to be heard. "She's beautiful," the delivering doctor said, placing the wrapped bundle in Emma's exhausted arms. "Small, but her lungs are strong and her vitals are excellent. We'll keep her in the NICU for observation, but I think she's going to be fine." Emma looked down at the tiny face, eyes squeezed shut, mouth working in instinctive searching motions. This was Grace. This was the reason she had built and fought and refused to surrender. This small, perfect human being who did not yet understand that she had been born into controversy and conflict, in a battle over shelter that remained unresolved. "Hello, Grace." Emma's voice cracked on the name. "I'm your mother. I built you a home, and whatever happens next, you will always have that." The hospital kept Emma for 3 days for recovery and Grace for 8 for observation. During that time, the world outside continued its relentless turning. The variance board announced that hearings would resume once the petitioner was medically cleared. The human chain at Emma's shelter remained in place, volunteers rotating through shifts to maintain continuous presence. News coverage expanded from local to national, her story becoming a touchpoint for debates about housing policy, corporate accountability, and the meaning of community in 21st century America. When Emma finally returned to the Eastern District, Grace bundled against the December cold in a car seat borrowed from the hospital. She found her shelter surrounded by people she had never met and provisions she had never requested. Blankets and food and baby supplies had accumulated on Mrs. Nguyen's porch. Donations from strangers moved by her story. A teenager she did not recognize was shoveling snow from the path to her door. An elderly man she had never seen was patching a section of her roof where December winds had loosened the sealant. Frank met her at the property line, looking as though he had not slept properly in days. "Welcome home," he said, the words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. "This is—" Emma surveyed the scene, struggling to comprehend the transformation. "I don't know what this is." "This is community," Frank said. "The thing we've been told doesn't exist anymore. That individualism has replaced. Turns out it was just waiting for something to organize around." The resumed variance hearing convened 2 weeks after Grace's birth. The boardroom was smaller this time, the main chamber still configured as a crime scene for federal investigators, but no less crowded. Emma attended with Grace in a carrier against her chest, the infant sleeping peacefully through proceedings that would determine her housing future. Grayfield Development Group was now represented by a single attorney rather than a team, the parent company having entered emergency restructuring following Harrison's arrest. Their arguments had shifted from confident assertion of property rights to cautious negotiation about liability and reputation. Emma's testimony was brief. She had said what needed saying at the first hearing. Now she simply answered questions from board members who had read transcripts and reviewed evidence and witnessed the FBI leading away the man who had claimed unassailable ownership of the land in question. The board deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned with their decision, Chairwoman Vance's expression offered no preview of the verdict. After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony, the variance board has reached the following conclusions. She read from prepared notes, each word precisely measured. 1. Grayfield Development Group retains legal ownership of the property at 847 Eastern District. This ownership is not affected by the criminal charges against its former principal officers. Emma's heart contracted. Legal ownership remained, the foundation of any eviction. 2, however, the board finds substantial evidence of bad faith conduct by Grayfield Development Group, including but not limited to bribery of public officials and violation of construction safety requirements. This conduct undermines the company's credibility regarding commitments to community welfare. A shift in the room's energy. Something was building toward a different conclusion than Emma had feared. 3. The board orders Grayfield Development Group to include a minimum of 30% affordable housing units in any future Eastern District development, an increase of 10% above standard requirements. The company must also establish a compensation fund of $10 million for victims of workplace accidents at their construction sites. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the chamber. These were substantive penalties, far beyond what anyone had expected from a variance hearing. 4. Regarding the petitioner's specific request, Chairwoman Vance looked directly at Emma. Ms. Collins has granted a variance permitting continued residence at the current structure for a period of 120 days. During this time, she must secure alternative housing arrangements. At the conclusion of the variance period, the existing structure must be removed to permit development to proceed. 120 days, 4 months, not permanent victory. Her shelter would still face demolition. But time to find proper housing, time for Grace to grow stronger, time for the next chapter of their lives to take shape. Finally, Chairwoman Vance added, the board formally recognizes Emma Collins for her role in exposing corruption within our municipal government. Her courage in building and in speaking has made Grayfield a more honest place. Whatever our legal constraints regarding property rights, we can acknowledge the moral weight of what she has accomplished. The gavel fell. The hearing concluded. Emma sat motionless at the petitioner's table, Grace stirring against her chest, trying to process a verdict that was both victory and defeat. She would have to leave her shelter. The home she had built with her own hands would be demolished. But Harrison was in custody. Corruption had been exposed, and she had 4 months rather than 4 days. Mrs. Nguyen reached her first, embracing her carefully to avoid disturbing the sleeping infant. Not everything we wanted, but more than we expected. They're still gonna tear it down. Brick and wood can be replaced. Truth, once buried, stays buried forever. You dug it up. Mrs. Nguyen's eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady. Hung's truth, my truth, 47 families' truth, that cannot be demolished. The 120 days passed with the strange acceleration of time when each moment matters. Grace grew from fragile newborn to robust infant, her early arrival proving no impediment to development. Emma divided her attention between caring for her daughter and preparing for the transition that loomed at the variance period's end. Frank Morrison, no longer employed by the city but no longer constrained by its regulations, became a constant presence. He taught Emma additional construction techniques, helped her document the shelter's design for possible recreation elsewhere, stood beside her during interviews with housing assistance programs that had finally found room on their waiting lists. Their relationship defied easy categorization. More than friendship, less than romance. Shaped by shared purpose rather than conventional courtship. Grayfield Housing Trust emerged from the crisis, a nonprofit organization founded by community members who had witnessed Emma's struggle and determined to prevent others from facing similar situations. Frank joined as construction advisor. Emma, when she was no longer pregnant and exhausted, began volunteering as an advocate for housing rights. The shelter that had started as desperate improvisation became a teaching model for DIY construction, visited by architecture students and housing activists and city planners seeking to understand what minimal viable housing might look like. William Harrison's legal proceedings ground forward through federal courts. Denied bail, he remained in custody while prosecutors assembled their case. Tyler Harrison disappeared entirely. Rumored to be in Seattle or Portland, or perhaps overseas, his fortune diminished by his father's collapse, but not eliminated. He continued sending monthly payments for Grace's support, the deposits appearing without personal communication, maintaining the minimum legal obligation of fatherhood while refusing its emotional burdens. Patricia Webb pleaded guilty to bribery charges in exchange for testimony against Harrison. The two council members followed suit, their confessions revealing a network of corruption that extended further than even Mrs. Nguyen's research had suggested. Grayfield's political landscape underwent seismic reorganization. Reform candidates replacing the incumbents who had enabled Harrison's regime. Day 120 arrived on a Wednesday morning in April. Spring had begun its cautious emergence. Crocuses pushing through remnant snow, birds returning from southern migrations, the air carrying hints of warmth rather than winter's persistent chill. Emma stood at the edge of her lot, Grace in a carrier on her chest, watching the demolition crew prepare their equipment. The shelter that had taken 3 months to build would be gone in hours. Every nail she had straightened and driven, every board she had salvaged and sealed, every joint that Mrs. Nguyen had helped her perfect, all of it would become debris, cleared to make room for the affordable housing units the Variance Board had mandated. "You don't have to watch," Frank said from beside her. "Yes, I do." Emma's voice was steady, grief processed over the preceding weeks until only acceptance remained. "I built this. I should witness its end." The first wall fell at 9:15, the one she had constructed from pallet wood during that first desperate week. The roof followed, corrugated plastic panels that had kept her dry through fall rains and winter storms. The foundation she had improvised from cinder blocks and wooden platforms, not up to code but functional, sufficient for its purpose, was the last to go, its pieces scattered by mechanical efficiency. By noon, nothing remained but bare earth. The lot looked exactly as it had when Emma first discovered it, empty and abandoned. No evidence that anyone had ever called it home. She wept then. Not for the loss of property or the failure of some larger cause, but for the simple grief of watching something she had created disappear. Those walls had sheltered her through the most difficult months of her life. That roof had covered her while Grace grew from concept to reality. Those windows, even the improvised ones made from picture frames and plastic sheeting, had let in light during her darkest times. Mrs. Nguyen appeared at her side, moving with the quiet certainty that characterized everything she did. She carried a document in her weathered hands, official-looking, bearing stamps and signatures. "Come with me," she said, leading Emma away from the demolition site toward her own property. They walked around Mrs. Nguyen's house to the back lot, a section of land Emma had passed many times but never particularly noticed. Perhaps 1,000 square feet, bordered by the elderly woman's vegetable garden on one side and an untended hedgerow on the other. This was to be for children's families someday. Space for grandchildren to play. Maybe for Mei Ling to build, if she ever returned to Grayfield. Mrs. Nguyen's gaze swept across the empty ground. Mei Ling lives in California now. Has for 10 years. She visits but will never come back to stay. Too many memories. Too much pain. She handed Emma the document, a property deed, transfer of land ownership from Lan Nguyen to Emma Collins. "I don't understand," Emma managed. "You can't just give me—" "Not giving, selling, $100 per month for 10 years. $12,000 total. Much less than market value, but I don't need market value. I need someone to build on land hung, and I bought when we thought our family would grow here." Mrs. Nguyen's eyes met Emma's with an intensity that demanded attention. "You will build again. Properly this time. Permits and inspections and everything by the book. But you will build on land that belongs to you, that no corporation can claim, that Hung's memory will protect." The document shook in Emma's hands. A piece of paper that represented everything she had fought for and more, not just shelter, but genuine ownership. A place to put down roots that no Harrison or development company could ever tear up. "Why would you do this for me?" Mrs. Nguyen's answer came without hesitation. "Because home is not brick and wood. Home is people who care for each other. Home can be built and rebuilt as many times as necessary. Hung knew this. He built our home not from materials, but from love. Now you will build Grace's home the same way." Construction on the new shelter began 3 days later. This time, permits were filed and approved through legitimate channels. The city's building department, purged of Harrison's influence, proving surprisingly cooperative with an applicant who had helped expose their predecessor's corruption. Design for Dignity, the nonprofit architecture firm that had created plans during Emma's original variance fight, provided updated blueprints for a structure that would meet all code requirements while remaining modest enough to build with volunteer labor. Materials arrived through a community donation rather than scavenging. Henderson's Hardware contributed electrical supplies at cost. The Restore Salvage store offered windows and doors from demolished properties. A local lumberyard owned by a family whose patriarch had worked alongside Hung Nguyen decades earlier provided framing materials at steep discount. And the volunteers came. Not just the core community who had stood in the human chain, but strangers drawn by Emma's story, by the videos that continued circulating online, by a desire to participate in something larger than their individual lives. Construction workers and retired teachers and college students and teenagers seeking volunteer hours, all of them appearing at the site with tools and willingness, asking only to help. Frank Morrison laid the first brick of the new foundation, Grace in Emma's arms, watching with the curious attention of a 4-month-old who did not understand what she was observing, but recognized its significance. "This time we do it right," he said, the words carrying weight accumulated over months of building and fightings and hoping. "Permits and inspections and everything by the code I used to enforce, but built by community, built by people who care." Lily arrived the following weekend, spring break from her California school providing an excuse for an extended visit. She carried her grandfather's hammer, the same tool that had helped construct homes across Grayfield for 30 years, and asked permission to drive a nail. "This was Grandpa's," she explained to Emma with the solemnity of a child entrusted with sacred objects. "Grandma says he would want me to use it." Emma guided Lily's hand as she drove the first nail of her life into a crossbeam that would support the new shelter's roof. The strike was crooked, the nail bent slightly, but it held. 3 generations of building encoded in that single moment. Hung Nguyen's legacy, passed through his widow, wielded by his granddaughter, contributing to a home that his tools had helped inspire. The structure rose over the following weeks. Framing gave way to sheathing. Sheathing gave way to roofing. Windows were installed properly this time. Double-paned, insulated, meeting every requirement that Frank had once cited as violations. Electrical work was done by licensed contractors donating their expertise. Plumbing connected to proper municipal water and sewer lines. By early June, the new shelter stood complete, 450 square feet of legitimate construction, modest but warm, meeting every code requirement while retaining the spirit of DIY determination that had characterized its predecessor. A small home built properly, owned outright by the woman who had learned to build by necessity and continued building by choice. 6 months after Grace's birth, 6 months after Emma's first shelter was demolished, the season had turned fully to summer, Michigan's brief warmth making outdoor work pleasant rather than punishing. Emma sat on the porch of her new home, her legal, permitted, properly constructed home, watching morning light spread across the lot where her community had gathered for a dedication ceremony. Grayfield Housing Trust had grown beyond anyone's initial expectations. Frank served as construction coordinator, training volunteers and building techniques that could help other families facing housing insecurity. Emma worked part-time as a housing advocate, using her experience to guide others through the bureaucratic maze of assistance programs and variance applications. The shelter she had built had become, as Mrs. Nguyen predicted, more than just her home. It had become a teaching model, a symbol, a proof of concept for what community-powered housing could accomplish. The doorbell rang, an actual doorbell this time, connected to proper electrical systems, and Emma rose to answer it. A young woman stood on the porch, perhaps 22 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that carried the particular exhaustion Emma recognized from her own mirrors a year earlier. Her belly swelled beneath an oversized sweatshirt, perhaps 5 months along. "I'm Tanya," she said, her voice wavering between hope and uncertainty. "I saw the flyers about the Housing Trust's building workshop. I thought maybe my situation is kind of complicated." Emma opened the door wider. "Mine was too once. Come in, we can talk about it." They sat in Emma's small living room, a space that would have seemed cramped to anyone accustomed to suburban excess, but felt abundant to someone who had once slept under tarps. Grace played on a blanket nearby, 6 months old now, healthy and thriving, oblivious to the weight of conversation happening above her. Tanya's story emerged in fragments. Evicted from her apartment after losing her job, estranged from family who disapproved of her pregnancy, turned away from overcrowded shelters. The details differed, but the shape was familiar. Another young woman facing impossible choices, another life requiring shelter that systems could not provide. "I saw your video," Tanya admitted, "the one where you're building the first shelter. I must have watched it 20 times. I kept thinking, if she could do that, maybe I could too. But I don't know anything about construction. I don't have tools or materials or any of the things you had. I didn't have them either at first." Emma leaned forward, remembering the weight of those early days when possibility seemed impossibly distant. "I had desperation and library books. Everything else came because I started." Started what? Building, reaching out, refusing to accept that no options existed just because none were offered. Emma glanced toward the window, toward the lot where her first shelter had stood and the new home that had replaced it. "Someone told me once that sometimes we build more than we intend. I thought I was just building shelter for my baby. Turns out I was building something bigger." She explained the housing trust, the workshops, the volunteer network that had emerged from her crisis. She offered Tanya enrollment in the next construction training session and connected her with emergency housing resources that had expanded since Emma's story brought attention to Grayfield's needs. She promised nothing she could not deliver, offered only what she actually possessed: knowledge earned through experience, connections built through shared struggle, the simple solidarity of someone who had been where Tanya now stood. Thanksgiving arrived with the first serious snow of the new winter. Emma's small home filled with warmth that no insulation could provide, the warmth of people gathered in shared celebration. Mrs. Nguyen sat at the table's head, the position her husband had occupied decades earlier. His photograph now hung on Emma's wall, beside the window that overlooked the garden Mrs. Nguyen had helped plant. Lily had returned for the holiday break, now 11 years old, already talking about studying architecture when she reached college age. Frank sat across from Emma, their relationship still evolving, still undefined, but present in ways that words could not capture. Grace occupied a high chair between her mother and grandmother, 6 months old and increasingly aware of the world around her. She reached for food on the table with determined curiosity, not yet understanding that the meal represented more than sustenance, that it celebrated survival and community and the building of something from nothing. 1 year ago, Emma said as they prepared to eat, I was sleeping under a tarp, not knowing if I would survive the winter. I had been abandoned by someone I trusted, rejected by systems designed to help people like me, forgotten by a society that measures worth in dollars. She looked around the table at faces that had become family through choice rather than blood. Now I have a home, a legal home built properly, owned outright. I have a daughter who will never know what it means to sleep in a car or under a bridge. I have people who showed up when I needed them and stayed when the crisis passed. Miss Nguyen raised her glass of tea in a gesture that somehow encompassed both toast and blessing. Hung used to say, we build what we can with what we have. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes it is more than enough. But we build anyway because the building is what matters. Outside the window, snow fell in lazy spirals, blanketing the eastern district in white. The abandoned lots that had once defined this neighborhood were slowly filling, some with the affordable housing mandated by the Variance Board, others with community gardens and pocket parks created through the organizing energy Emma's story had released. The decay remained but no longer felt permanent. Renewal was possible. Change was visible. Lily raised her own glass, orange juice, the color bright against the window's gray-white backdrop. To Grandpa, she said with the earnest solemnity of childhood, for leaving behind tools and truth so we could keep building. And they drank together, 3 generations united by circumstance and choice. Emma looked at Grace, still too young to understand any of it, and felt the weight of responsibility that motherhood carried. This child would grow up knowing her origin story, the abandoned lot, the shelter built from salvage, the battle against corporate power that had shaped her earliest days. She would learn that homes were not given, but created, that community was not found, but built, that desperation could be transformed into determination if one refused to accept impossible circumstances. The meal continued, conversation flowing between past and present and future. Frank discussed plans for expanding the Housing Trust construction program. Mrs. Nguyen shared memories of Hung that she had kept private for 15 years, but now felt ready to release. Lily talked about her school in California and her growing interest in how buildings were designed and constructed. Emma listened more than she spoke, absorbing the texture of normalcy that had once seemed impossibly distant. A year ago, she would have given anything for this: warmth, safety, company. Now she possessed it not through luck or charity, but through labor, through the building of something that no one could take away because it existed not just in physical form, but in the bonds between people who had struggled together. When the dishes were cleared and the visitors prepared to depart, Emma stood alone for a moment on her porch, Grace sleeping inside in the crib Frank had built from reclaimed wood. The snow had stopped, leaving the world covered in fresh white, unmarked, and full of possibility. She thought of Hung Nguyen, whose evidence had waited 15 years for its moment, of Mrs. Nguyen, who had kept silence until silence became unbearable, of Frank, who had risked his career to help a stranger because he remembered what it meant to have nowhere to go, of the dozens of volunteers who had stood in a circle around her first shelter, protecting something they had never built because they understood its value. We build what we can with what we have, Emma whispered into the cold night air. And sometimes what we build becomes more than we ever imagined. Behind her, through the window of her properly constructed, legally permitted, community-built home, she could see the lights of Mrs. Nguyen's house, the glow of Frank's pickup truck headlights as he departed, the distant shimmer of gray fields downtown where changes continued unfolding. The Eastern District was not transformed. Poverty remained. Housing insecurity persisted. The systems that had failed Emma continued failing others, their flaws deeper than any individual story could repair. But something had shifted, something in the community's understanding of what was possible, in the relationships between people who had once been strangers, in the physical landscape where new construction rose beside old decay. Emma Collins had come to this place with nothing but desperation and the memory of her father's hands teaching her to build. She had created shelter from debris. She had uncovered truth from beneath years of silence. She had given birth to a daughter who would never know the particular terror of having nowhere to go. And she had learned through months of struggle and building and fighting that home was not a location or a structure. Home was the people who refused to let you fall. Home was the community that formed when individuals recognized their shared humanity. Home was not given. Home was built, one nail at a time, one board at a time, one act of stubborn creation at a time. From ruin to hope, from abandonment to belonging, from a tarp in an empty lot to a proper house on land she owned. The building continued.